位贵宾还有师长，大家好。非常欢迎大家参与我们这一场第二次的这个包庇德教授的系列讲第二场。那么上一场包庇德教授是比较从方法论的检讨方向来探讨思想史的研究，那么同时也介绍了好几位思想家之间的对比。那今天这一场它的标题叫做经世之学，但是副标题蛮有趣的，是一个无关政治，但是打一个问号，所以这边有一些弹性。那么我想今天看起来那个包庇德教授会从一个所谓思想史跟学术史的观点来探讨经世之学到底是什么样的特质，那么看跟政治之间的关系又是怎么一回事。那他可能比较不会太谈到政治上的政治哲学或者意识形态，那这一点上面我想他会谈一个比较从一个学术史跟思想史的观点来探讨。那另外一点要稍微做一点说明，就是说因为包庇德教授觉得他戴着口罩讲话又用中文讲的表达上比较不清楚，因为今天还是他最后一天得戴上口罩，那他今天会用英语演讲为主，那他也很贴心的为我们准备他的演讲的这个纲要，所以各位手上应该都有他的中文的这个纲要，那同时他 PowerPoint 上面也是很多中文的资料，所以我想我们应该可以很容易 follow 没有问题。那最后在 Q&A 的时间里面，当然大家还是可以用中文跟他来做交流，这是没有问题的。好，那我就不占用时间，那我们大家一起来欢迎包庇德教授。
谢谢杨教授的介绍。那么因为我现在有中国稿子，所以我想我可以用英文讲，你们可以看这个中文，也是这个所引用的文本都会在这儿。讨论的时候就用汉语讨论 ，OK？ 那么我在第一场就讲到说有在方法论，就是有5个经验的领域，每个我们人类的经验领域，每个领域有相关的关联的学术传统，我在前一次就提到了3个比较，就是苏轼跟宋代的苏轼跟明代的王世贞、王安石跟黄宗羲、朱熹与顾先生，就像3个例子：文学、经世之学，跟那个经世之学不是那个字，那跟三照就是道学。那么今天就开始从statecraft learning 经世之学，no place for politics. So 无关政治嘛 This is the idea. And one of the things that I mentioned last time was that politics can mean that there is a struggle for authority, a struggle for power, and that this can be true in any field, not just in government, but in any field. And thus, the question that I raise is it possible that in Chinese conceptions of Jingshi, of how to govern the state, there is a view that there is no place for struggle over power? And I think that's generally true, and you will hear that today in some of the people I'm going to talk about. I'm going to begin with Sima Guang, right? And his great Bianyan Shi, his analytic history, the Zizhi Tongjian. Now, Sima Guang is known for that work, of course, and it is a great work. But it's important to understand that the way Sima Guang worked was that he already knew what was important. He had a point to prove. And in fact, he had written a number of books before this point, in which he laid out his his understanding of how government worked or should work. And I think one of the best examples of this is something he writes in one of his memorials. He uses an analogy. What should government be like? It should be like a house that belongs to an owner, the ruler in this case, the Renju. And he says, suppose you have a great house here and you want to pass it on to your descendants. Well, what do you have to do? You have to, there's a lot of echo here. Do you hear the echo or just me? Okay, can somebody fix that? This is too close or what? Okay. A person has a great house, he says, and would like to pass it on to his descendants. He must solidify the foundation, fortify the pillars, strengthen the beams, reinforce the roof, raise the walls, tighten the lock. Good descendant to give it to. And then he goes on and explains what the analogy is about. Right? The populace, the min, are the foundation of the state. Ritual and law, right? Lifa are its pillars. High ministers, right? Gongqing, its beams, the bureaucracy, the baiguan, right? Its roof, the bailija, right? The generals, its walls, the troops, its lock. If you carefully maintain it, it can last. And he says at one point, in fact, that it can last for 1,000 years, right? There is no reason why a dynasty should. One of the things he's doing is showing that, in fact, dynasties do fail. But why do they fail? They fail because they don't follow the rules. They fail because they do not observe that there are universal rules for a government. And that's what he's going to show them with the Zizhitongjian. He begins the Zizhitongjian with the 923年, right? What happened in that year, this is the Shigu, this is the causal event, right? That leads to the failure of the Zhou dynasty, right? Happens then when the Zhou king, the Zhou Wang, allows the Daifu of Jin to divide the state of Jin into 3 pieces and to become Zhuhou themselves. And Sima Guang then proceeds to comment in Chengguangyue, and he says, I have heard that the Son of Heaven's official responsibilities, none is more important than ritual. In ritual, nothing is more important than roles, than fun, right? And in roles, nothing is important than Ming, than names. What is ritual? It is the Jigang, it's the guidelines. What are roles? Haweifan, Junchan Shiya, it's the ruler and minister. What are names? They're Gong Ho Qing Da Fu Dangda, right? He proceeds to explain then, right, what this is all about. So Li is the Jigang, right? What does that mean? It means Sangjir Sha, Yo Xin Fuzhi Yun Shouzu, right? It is the relationship, basically what it is, it's the Shangsha Zhifan, right? It's the relationship between superior and inferior, which in his view is a relationship that will guarantee, right, that each fills its role and serves the other. Superiors, let's see, am I right here? This is, no, back there. Superiors directing inferiors, like the heart employs the limbs and the root and trunk ordering the branches and leaves, etc., etc. Thus I say, Gu Yue Tianzi Zhi Zhi Mo Da Yu Li, right? Now, in Li, why is fun more important? Is because, as he says, Jun Chen Zhi Fui You Tiandi Zhi Bu Ke Yi, right? The notion that these roles are not arbitrary, they are necessary, right? Just as much as heaven and earth are. And why is it true that, and this is the part that is unusual, right? That Fan Mo Da Yu Ming, why is it that you could say that role is nothing more important, and roles nothing is more important than Ming? Because it's precisely that Ming and Qi, right, the accoutrements of a position, the clothes you wear, the symbols and things like this, that these define your position in a hierarchy. Ritual distinguishes between ranks, needs, relatives, regulates the many matters and structures all activities. Only after the will for superior and inferior be clear. This is the great constant of ritual. If the names and accoutrements are lost, how can ritual survive by itself? Truly, it is because once names and accoutrements are lost, we're disordered. Inferior would lack the means to protect each other. Now, all problems begin with something small, something insignificant, but culminate in something obvious, because the sage considers the long-term consequences. he's able to attend to what is insignificant and correct it. And that's just what happens in Jin, right? That the son of heaven, the Zhou Wang, right? To divide the country. He agrees to their request because he feels he doesn't have the power. But as you know, what Sima Guang goes on to explain at great length, right? Zhou Wang ye kei shuo bu, right? The Zhou Wang can say no to. All he has to do is refuse to give in. Then who knows? Maybe people will come to assist him. Maybe he will succeed. But because he gives up ritual, right? Here, he is no longer able to defend these inconsequential names and roles, so he throws them all away. At this point, Shen Wang Zhili, Yu Se Jin, right? And that's the end of the Zhou dynasty in 403 BC, Ma Guang's perspective. Now, Sima Guang thinks that he is showing what history shows, right? That is, I think he's quite sincere in that. But I think we might say that he makes history show what he thinks, right? And that he is, in fact, begins with an understanding of how things should be and tries to show that history confirms his vision, that every dynasty fails. To the degree it succeeds because it follows his vision. And if it fails because it contravenes his vision, right? And his vision is basically a structural vision of structured relationships that are kept in stability and permanent. Now, the kind of history he does is bianianshi, is analytic or chronological, right? And that makes sense because, in fact, an analytic history is exactly one that is good at tracing political decisions, right? It's not good at seeing the whole country. It's good at court history. It's good at looking at what happens in the Chaoting and how the Tianzi makes decisions and how other people operate. It's good, in fact, at following politics in the sense of the struggle for power. And his model gets adopted in Sung, right? Li Tao with his Shuzi for all of the northern Sung, for Beisong. Li Xinchuan for Jian Yi Dai Xin Yin Yao for the early Sung restoration. Chen Jun, the Huangcha Bian Yan Gamu Beao. It's not until that Chen Jian in the 1550s does something like this for the Ming Dynasty. But what we're seeing is that, in fact, all of these are not necessarily sharing Sima Guang's vision. They're sharing his method. And his method is a method of court politics, right? To try to show, in this case, I think as Charles Harpenter showed, very much with Li Tao, to show that, in fact, Wang Anshi and the Xinfa were wrong in all ways. Now, if this were a lecture about political thought, right, we would have to spend a lot of time talking about Wang Anshi. But it's not a lecture about political thought. It's a lecture about, in some sense, about the methodology of creating knowledge for governing, right? And Sima Guang is a great example of that. Wang Anshi, however, it should be mentioned, has a vision, right? And it's a vision quite different from Sima Guang's. It's a vision which stresses, I think, the Yi Dao de Tong Feng Su point of view, right? He says, you know, in antiquity, right, it was all unified. Today it's not. And the question is, does he think this is Buddha Shi Shi Ru Gu, we have to accept that, or does he think he can change that? And I think he more or less thinks he can change that with his education system. It's good to keep in mind that the first truly universal education system for the elite in China begins with an attempt to try to enforce intellectual uniformity on the population, which explains why, in fact, in Southern Song, some people were opposed to it. Now, Wang Anshi's vision was a vision of an organic whole. It was integrated. It was self-perpetuating, self-correcting, right? Just as Sima Guang's vision was a whole, a structural whole, his model was a house. Wang Anshi's vision of an integrated whole was the living body, right? Wang Anshi was not interested in history. He was not interested in statecraft in the same way. He was much more of an institutionalist, in fact. But in any case, I'm going to leave Wang Anshi behind. The person I want to compare Sima Guang to is Ma Duanlin. How many of you ever looked at Ma Duanlin's Wenqian Tongkao? No one. Yeah, one, okay. Only one person, okay. Ma Duanlin's Wenqian, you have to look. Yeah, come on, right? I'm getting very upset, right, if some historians haven't seen Ma Duanlin. So, Ma Duanlin's Wenqian Tongkao is a very, very important and very, very interesting book, which has been very, very understudied. We all study the Zizhi Tongjian, right? Because we think that Zizhi Tongjian 可以算是一个通史, 中国通史, right? And in fact, the first great European history of China, detailed history of China, was by Otto Frank in German, the Geschichte des Chinesischen Reiches. And that was basically a translation of the Zizhi Tongjian, right? Going up through the Wudan, through the 5 dynasties before the Song. And so we've come to conceive of this Bianyan Shi as a kind of Tongshi. That is not what Ma Duanlin has to say. Ma Duanlin's point is that, in fact, right, to examine institutions, to investigate laws, to know a lot, to have broad knowledge, this is also what it means to be a Tongru, right? Then he goes on, after the Shi, the Shu, the Chunshou, right? There was only the Tai Shi Gong, just Sima Qian, right? His history, which had as you know, the Banji, the Liezhuang, the Shu, which is sort of like the Kao, the treatises, later called Zhi, and the Biao, right? And these were narrating order and chaos, rise and decline, right? The 8 treatises, the Bashu, right, were narrated laws and institutions. So one of the things he's trying to get at is that this notion of Zhidu and Xianzhang is important. Because exactly Zhidu and Xianzhang are not in the Zizhi Tongjian, right? It's a different kind of history. And then he says down here at the bottom, right? Well, after Sima Qian is great, but then comes Luang Banggu, and we get Duan Daishi, and everybody does Duan Daishi until Sima Guang. And then we have, with the Zizhi Tongjian, we have something that tries to break the Duan Daishi mode. That's a very good thing. But the problem is, Sima Guang is only talking about Li Luan Shang Shuai. He's talking about political power. He's talking about court politics. And he's not talking about Xianzhang Zhidu. He's not talking, or Xianzhang Jingzhi. He's not talking about institutions. And his point is this, if you think about court politics and, Li Luan Xing Shuai, order Zhi Luan Xing Shuai, right? Then it's Bu Xiang Yin. It's not continuous through time. In fact, a dynasty falls, a new dynasty comes, there's political struggle and so on. But institutions are Xiang Yin. And that's what the Wenqian Tongkao is meant to prove, is that institutions, right? Institutions are continuous over time. And so he goes on and says, let's see. Yeah. When Sima Guang did I think that's probably enough. You get the point, I think, there. In my view, he said, order and chaos, rise and decline are not continuous. Here's an alternative, then, to Sima Guang's Zizhi Tongjian. It's an alternative to the notion. His point is, of course, that Sima Guang's Zizhi Tongjian is not a Tongshi. If there's a Tongshi, his is much closer to being one, because it shows real continuity over time. And in that sense, I think he's probably right. He calls his book Wenqian Tongkao, right? And he calls it Wenqian Tongkao because he's doing two things. The first thing he's doing is he's trying to put together a collection of credible evidence. This is the one, the documents. And together with that, he has the views of scholars at the time. And notice that he says, 当时传了之奏书, right? I want to know what people at the time thought about their institutional issues, right? And that's going to be called the xian, right? So he's going to have two things. He's going to have an account based on credible sources, right, of what the institutions were, and then he's going to have an account of contrasting views of what institutions should do and what the policy decisions were. And this is what that looks like. And this is the first part, the first gen, the Tianfu Kao. And so he goes on and he'll talk about something and then he'll quote. So that's the one, right? And this is the Shen, right? In this case, very simple one where Confucius says, or we'll take this from one of his innovations, which is the Jingji Zhi, based in part on Chao Gongwu's book, but more than that, because if we look at in this item, right, he's talking about the various kinds of Yiwen Zhi that exist, and then he gives you a quote from Chao Gongwu. Then he has here he has Su Dongpo, Su Shi, and then he has, I think he has Yesher in here, Yesher in here too. Yeah, Shui Xin Yesher. Again, Northern Sung and Southern Sung commentators, and brings their comments to bear. It is, I think, one of the great works of Chinese historiography, and much undervalued in my view. Now, he had predecessors. He had Sung predecessors. There were things like Lu Zuqian's Li Dai Zhi Du Xiang Shuo, Zhang Ruyu's Chun Shu Kao Suo. There were Hui Yao from the Song and so on. But his real predecessor was Du You's, the Tang Dynasty, Tongdian, which he adopts, he follows, and then adds 4 new Kao, 4 new sections. But it's not, as he says, a book about political hierarchy. It's not a book about rulership. He wrote introductions to each of his, he calls his things Kao, right? So it's a Tong Kao, right? Of the one and the Shen. It's a thorough examination, comprehensive examination of the sources and comments, historical comments on government. The first of his is about, I'll just give you 3 examples. Tianfu Kao, then the Qianbi Kao, and then the Zhengque Kao. The point that he makes is that history does begin in antiquity. Antiquity had many good things about it, right? But we cannot go back. We cannot go back. And in each case, this is the point I think that he is making. Right? The first investigation in 7 Juan on land tenure, Tianfu, right? Also covering Shuili, Duntian, and Guantian, begins the ancient system of begins with Sandai Zhigu, belonged to the, because it was held by the feudal nobility who treated people as family. The people were apportioned fields, all saw themselves as a community, and there was neither rich nor very poor. Qin made the land the property of a single ruler, replaced enfeoffment with bureaucracy, and gave up land redistribution. And efforts to restore the Jingtian system of land redistribution and antiquity in northern Wei. For him, Fengjian and Jingtian go together. But, as he says, 一火编织, our fan yu fan rao wu ji, right? We will end up with chaos, so we cannot go back. The second investigation on money explains the development of coin, and eventually how paper notes, paper money, came into being to be used as money, which is not necessarily a good thing. But he says, in the end, it's more convenient than bronze coins. The third investigation on commercial taxes and monopoly taxes gives the rationale for taxes on natural products and commerce. to finance the state and reduce burdens on the farmers by taxing those who control natural resources and taxing merchants. But in the end, he points out, this led the state to create monopolies. And when monopolies were created, instead of the rich and powerful paying for the extra cost of government, in fact, it ended up being a burden on the farming population. Nevertheless, we cannot go back. Ma Duan-lin has explained how institutions developed over time. He provides policy choices, he provides policy justifications, he provides commentary and criticism. But it's clear that for him, government, 经世, right? Governing is about institutions. And that helps explain, perhaps, why Xue Xuan, who is a Dao Xuejia, a moral philosopher from the 15th century in the Ming Dynasty, right? One of his students comes to him and says, 老师, 我们家里我找到了一个很有意思的一本书，叫文献通考，我们是不是有机会可以再出版？ And Xue Xuan answers him, 文献通考，我家固有之，博而不约，非理学者所及。 That's the end of that discussion, right? So the fact that you could have a view of Jingshi which says it doesn't matter, right? Governing institutions are not what's crucial, and a view that says they are crucial leads me to my next point, which is statecraft learning, 经世之学, as guidance for rulers, being an example, the case being Zhen Dexiu in southern Song, Nansong, and Qiu Jun in middle of the Ming. Right? Zhen Dexiu's 大学演义, right? Amplification of the meaning of the great learning. 大学, you all know the 大学, right? 大学之道在明明德，在亲民，在知于善，知之后有定等。But the important part of the 大学, for those of you who have forgotten it, is this part. It's called the 八条目, right? 故知明明德于天下，先知其国. If you want to order your state, first you have to you have to order. If you want to broadcast your virtue to the world, you must first order your state. If you want to order your state, you 齐其家, you 齐其家, you 诚其身, 守其身, you 守其身, 先正其心, 正其心, 先诚其知, 先知其知, 知之在格物. Becomes in the hands of Zhu Xi, an explanation of the process of how we how we 穷理, right? And the relationship between individual cultivation, social responsibility, and political order. But Zhen Dexiu, when he gets to this book, Zhu Xi said, this 大学, this 这部书, right, is for all people who learn, everybody, for you too. Zhen Dexiu, when he gets it, he says, I'm going to turn this into a book for the ruler. And as a book for the ruler, it becomes the most influential political tract probably in East Asia. In Korea, in Japan, for the Mongols, for the Manchus, because in some sense it glorifies the ruler, as you will see. Okay, what am I? 18 now? He organizes it like this, right? This is, there are 43 zhen. The first two parts are Diwan Wei Zhi Xue, Wei Zhi Xiu, and then Wei Xue Zhi Ban. And then this part is Ge Wu Zhi Zhi, that's the basis of self-cultivation. Then we have some chapters in here on Chengyi Zhengxin, the next two steps. Then we have parts on Xiushen, right? And then Qijia. What's missing? 治国平天下. There's no 治国平天下 in the 大学演义 book, right? For a good reason. Because, as he explains, when I first read The Great Learning, you all see that, right? When I first read The Great Learning, I saw that its structure was orderly and its development was regulated. To be a ruler and not know the Daxue is to lack the means to clarify the source of governance. To be a minister, not know the Daxue, is to lack the means to realize the model for correcting the ruler. Then I investigated the governance of the emperors and kings of antiquity. They all based it in the self and extended it to the world. Then I knew that this truly is the essential text of the sage's transmission of the mind. It is not the personal view of Confucius. So in some sense, he's answering those who say, 对，就是孔子那老头的意思，你不用管, right? He says, no, this is actually a true reflection of our tradition going back to the sages, right? And that's what he sets out to do in his chapters. If you look, but first, just a word about his method. So what he does is he quotes. This is important to keep in mind, because we'll see in the next case that this is being done to. He quotes in the text something from one of the Wu Jing, begin with. Then he will explain what the words mean. If there are any difficult words, he'll give a gloss, right? He'll quote later writers, right? So it's not just, for example, the Yao Dian or the Shun Dian. He also quotes Han and Tang and Song Dynasty commentators on it. Then he concludes with my own view, right? What I think, where you see Chang'an, right? So in this case, Yangzi is Yang Xiong from the Han Dynasty, and then he gets there, then he gives you a comment from himself, the view of that. Then he goes back and he quotes Zhou Deni from the Beisong, and then he'll go on and give his own view again. He piles this up. Sometimes it's repetitive, sometimes it's boring, sometimes it's interesting, but he always has an argument to make. It begins with Di Wang Wei Zhi Zhi Xu, which is with a quote from Yao Dian, and you can see him explaining to the ruler what all these words mean. And then he begins with his own comment, and I've given that full comment there. It's not visible here, right? And what he's doing is he's saying that the canon from Yao, the Yao Dian, is the Yushu from the Yao Dian, saying he was able to manifest his bright virtue and be familial with the people, his clan. Once his clan was in harmony, he enlightened his people. When his people were enlightened, he brought into accord the myriad states. He then explains why he thinks, right, that this is the source of the Daxue. Right? So what he's doing is taking a Daxue, which is one of the Sishu, which is a later work from the Han Dynasty possibly, and saying, no, this work actually, no matter whether it's a later work or not, it articulates the view of the ancient sages. He did not know that the Da Yu Mo and works like that were actually later works too, but we're leaving that aside. And so he's trying to show that there is this one tradition, one correct tradition, that goes back to the sages, in some sense that the ruler cannot escape it. It's rules that he must follow as well. And that is why his goal is to show Daxue is fei Kongzi zhi si yan, right? It's not the private view of Confucius. It is a universal view of our civilization. Right? And who are you to say as ruler, no? But then if we look at the logic for this, what he's telling the ruler is, 帝王位置之术，盖人之一生，是天下国家之本，而经之一言，就是修身之本也。So that the idea then is, you ruler, why does this matter? Why does shoshan matter? Self-cultivation, it matters because you, in fact, are the real basis for the state. Everything depends upon you. You know, there are no rulers in Chinese history, at least after the Sandai Zhigu, who were sages. They were all self-interested in one way or the other. And so we see these Daoxue battling against who the rulers really are, trying to persuade them that they should be something else. Nevertheless. And then he talks about Diwang Wei Xue Zhi Ben. And what is this Wei Xue Zhi Ben? He quotes this passage, the Shi Liu Zi that we talked about at the last lecture, Ren Xin Wei Wei, Dao Shen Wei Wei, Wei Jing Wei, Yun Zhi Jue Zhong. And then he quotes the entirety of Jushi's Zhongyong Zhangjushu and explains it, right? So he's putting himself fully bringing Jushi into the picture. Let's see, 22. Yeah. Then at the end, he has things like, Jingyi Zhinei, Yi Fang Wai. To be reverent, Xinfa, Jingyi Zhinei, Yi Fang Wai, the last part. For if he is reverent, then his mind will be free of selfishness and evil. This is how the internal is kept straight. And if he is principled, then each activity and thing will be in its proper place. This is how the external is put right. But the ruler says to him, yeah, I know I'm not a sage, right? You're asking me to be like the sage kings. Sage kings were Sheng'er Zhizhi, and I'm not Sheng'er Zhizhi, right? What about that? And his answer is, well, yes, it's true, right? But what you can be Sheng'er Ke is Yili Zhiyuan, and for the rest, it depends on learning, right? Which is what I am giving you. But at the very least, what you know, right, is do not follow the rulers of Han and Tang. And that, of course, was the great division in thinking about politics in the Song Dynasty. Are Han and Tang history an adequate source of models for governing? Or do we have to go back to a world before the imperial system? As Zhen Deshou goes on to explain in chapter 3, in Zhen 3, even in antiquity, there were rulers who only came close to getting it right. In chapter 4, in Zhen 4, he says that Han Tang rulers violated it in general. His goal was to bring the ruler back on the right track by adducing examples of ancient ideals and historical failures, right? In 4 sets of essentials. These Yao, right? Each with 2 steps of the great learning. Each with various subcategories. Investigating things, extending knowledge, making the will sincere, correcting the mind, cultivating the person, regulating the family, the imperial family, not your family. He's compiled precedents and provided an abundance of materials to those who want to instruct rulers. But the last 2 steps, 治国平天下, ordering the state passed by the world, are absent. There's no need to talk about government, Zhen Deshou tells the ruler, because when the way of these 4, right, 四者之道德，则治国平天下在其中矣. So we have set governing aside in favor of a ruler's cultivation. Perhaps that's why rulers like the idea, not that they did it. This brings me to Chou Jun, because Chou Jun writes a book that he calls the Dashui Yanyi Bu. The Dashui Yanyi was 43 juan. The Dashui Yanyi Bu is 160 juan. It's a big bu, right? It's a big continuation. And it includes, as you can see, everything that actually Zhen Deshou doesn't want to talk about, right? Rectifying the imperial court, rectifying officialdom, Zheng Baiguan, right? Securing the foundation of the nation, controlling expenditures, everything that's practical and real in governing the state is his subject. Each of these in turn contains multiple topics. Cho adopted, remember the format that Zhen Deshou used, which is quote a text, quote later comments, quote your own view, give your own views. He adopts the exact same procedure, and in many instances he quotes Changyi, Jushi, all the Dao Xuejia, showing, in fact, that they can be made to fit what he wants to say. Became a popular work. Zhu Honglam has said that it probably became the most important work on statecraft in its day. The court ordered it printed and distributed to schools in the 1480s. There were 8 editions, full editions, published before the end of the Ming, and many more shorter versions. The first order divisions let's see. Yeah, so, okay, no, I have to go on a bit. So why is this a supplement? Why is this a boo? Do I have it here? No, so yeah, oh, okay. Why is this a boo? Why is this a supplement? For Zheng Shou, institutional knowledge was second-order knowledge, not important, but could be acquired as useful. For Zheng Shou, for the ruler to make correct decisions, required that he be free of selfishness, of zisi, right, of siyu, and thus he could see the li of things, the coherence of things. For him, moral motivation, for Zheng Shou, moral motivation was the issue. But Chojun wants to show that, in fact, right, knowledge of outcomes is essential. He wants to begin, so when he does a bu, he's going to take Zheng Shou's Chengyi Zhengxin and bu it, and add a particular connection to that, right? Between the rise of a thought, what he calls the ji, right, and the outcome in affairs, in shi. So he wants to show that Zheng Shou is wrong. Zheng Shou said, just worry about your moral motivation. And Chojun says, no, it's the thought you have as it arises has consequences, if you're a ruler, consequences in the decisions you make and the policy out there which affects people. So what you need to do, ruler, is you need to understand the consequences in order to make the right decision in your mind. He says, yes, I agree, the mind is the bun. It's the ruler's mind that matters, but what we have to do is make the ruler understand his mind correctly, his ideas correctly. The shi, right, the affairs take place over time, right? They have incipiencies, they have ji, right? When, as he quotes Chengyi down there at the bottom, right? When the superior man sees the unapparent, he knows the manifestations. Don't reflect on your motivations, reflect on the consequences of your choices. I'll give two very brief examples. Let me see what time it is. Good. The first comes from his discussion of Zhaohua, which seems to be a very good Confucian subject, a very good Daoxue subject, right? Education begins, he says, with inculcating norms of behavior. This is, as he has 22 items, quotes, comments, and his own views, right? And so I've just summarized it here and brought it all together. He says education begins with inculcating norms. The norms are the Wulun, right? The Jun Chen Fu Zi, Fu Fu Peng You, Xiong Di Deng Deng. They get people to enact these norms. Superiors have to have set models. But then he says, oh, by the way, there are regional differences in this country. You can't expect everybody in all places to behave the same. What? Right? That's beyond Zheng Shou's imagination, right? That we should take regional differences into account because Zheng Shou is operating in terms of moral ideas. Education has to go beyond the Wulin to include institutions in all aspects of social life. The ruler has to ensure that policies increase the material benefit and welfare of the people. And you have to recognize that people seek to profit. It's okay if people are self-interested. Again, that's not a position the Neo-Confucians want to accept. So your job is to use education to guide them. The second example is very different. It's from the Zhiguoyong on the state financing section, and it's about paper money and coinage. It's about the money. It's about money supply, right? And here he has a set of 33 items on the origins and history of metal coin and paper notes. Remember, paper money begins in the Song Dynasty. And he goes back all the way to the beginning and ends up with a conclusion that the right system fiscal system for the country involves coinage, bronze coins, tongqian, right? Paper money, zhibi, and silver, a tripartite system. But he begins with guanzi and the zhouli. He works through the shi-huo-zhi of the various dynastic histories, and so on, until he gets to the appearance of huizi, the paper money in southern Song. He has other topics as well. He is about controlling inflation, backing paper money with silver in yuan, creating different denominations of money, why coin is better than commodities for exchange, etc., etc. So, in fact, his studies, his accounts of all these issues, is showing not only the consequences of policy decisions and the historical development over time, he's also showing that all these things have many, many different aspects. And so, if you ask the question, what is Gewu Chungli? That's what he's doing, in some sense. He's giving it, applying this, right, to the world out there. But I think he was rejecting Dao Xue. I think he's fundamentally differing with Zhen Deshou. But many people wanted to claim that that it was coterminous with that. Because he said, yes, I'm all in favor of Shoushan. I'm all in favor of the rulers Shouyang. But there's all this other stuff too. Some of the people at the time did criticize him. They said, recognized that he in fact had given up on Shoushan and was focused on something else. The next topic I want to talk about is something that happens after Choujun. It's a different kind. So both Choujun and Zhen Deshou provided the liao, if you will, the materials for thinking about how to order the state. Okay? They have broad historical views going through all of history since antiquity. They cover many topics. They have fundamentally different points of view, but methodologically, they're doing very similar things. Now, with Zhang Juzheng and Liu Kun, they represent a very different style. But they are not unique. I'm going to give them as two examples, but in fact we know that during their lifetimes, there was a proliferation of books that are sometimes called guanzhen, that are handbooks for officials. All sorts of levels, every office that you could imagine, right? There are people who are writing books saying, this is how to do this office. And the distinction I want to make is between process statecraft and system statecraft. Zhen Deshou, Choujun, Ma Duanlin, Sima Guang represent system statecraft. In other words, they see systems, right? And they want to see systems developing over time. Process statecraft says it's the process. You don't have to worry about the system. It's the process that matters. The simple way of saying this in English is that the lesson is do your job. Everyone has a position. Everyone has a job. Just do your job. Don't worry about the larger picture. Do your job. And everything will be all right. My first example, again, but they were not unique, so I'm just using them as examples, but I could have cited 50 other works that are like this from the same period. Okay? Begin with Zhang Juzheng. Zhang Juzheng actually is, I think, I should say one last thing. Process statecraft versus system is a philosophical distinction. You have process thinkers and systematic system thinkers, right? There's two different philosophical approaches. It's not made up by me. Although it would be okay if it was, to tell you the truth. So Zhang Juzheng was the tutor to the prince who became the Longjing emperor. And when his student took the throne, he submitted a very famous memorial, Chen Liu Shi Shu, a very, very important memorial, that actually made sure that he was like a helicopter rising into the leadership. He begins with a distinction that incorporates Zhen Deshou and Choujun, but with a preference for the latter. He says, in this first quote, As for the way of emperors and kings of antiquity governed the world, there was a great foundation and there were urgent responsibilities. To correct the mind, cultivate the person, establish the standards so as to be a model to the ministers and to the people was the great foundation, the great basis of governing. Okay, so that's pure Zheng. Right? To examine incipiencies, Ji, right? Assess the situation, make changes, succor the people were the urgent responsibilities for saving the times. Even if the great basis is established, to be able to make changes to improve the situation, to be unable to make those changes, to improve governance, is analogous to failing to adjust a zither that has gone out of tune, right? 披着琴瑟不调，不调，不接而更长之，不可故也. Right? Okay. So that's his principle. He's going to tell the ruler in 6 memorials what to do. So he's telling the ruler how to do his job. He's assuming that if the ruler does his job correctly, everything will be okay. Right? Either he's assuming that or he's just taking the practical view, which is that only do what's within your powers to do. And all these things, he makes the point, are within your powers to do. If you haven't read these memorials, I recommend them. They're written in a very accessible fashion. It's clearly meant he wants the ruler to read it and think about it. They're a little bit luosuo, right? In a way that, in Sung Dynasty writing, we would think this is poorly written because it's too luosuo. But in the Ming Dynasty, that's how they write. Deterioration of culture, no doubt. But he begins with what he calls trying to reduce the number of, let me find my place here. He says there's constant expression of conflicting opinions at court. Your job as emperor is to reduce that, to boil that down, to keep decisions, to making decisions. But if there are too many opinions and you listen to all opinions all the time, you will not make a decision. There is no perfect solution. It has neither complete profit, as he says, or complete loss. People have their strengths, they have their weaknesses. The important thing is to weigh them and choose which is best. Right? Second, right? Zhenjigang, tighten discipline. Officials are lax, they're lazy, they're not fulfilling their roles, they're not doing their jobs. And people will say to you, oh, if you're too strict, that goes against renqing. Right? But in fact, what they really mean is we want you, ruler, to shunqing, to give in to people's feelings. Right? And what you should be doing is shunqing, going along with what people generally want. Right? And you can be strict. You can be strict without being coercive. Third, zhong zhaoling, right? You got to see that your commands are carried out. Right? The job of ministers is to be responsible for orders, carrying out the ruler's orders and extending them to the people. Local government must restore procedures to ensure that orders are acknowledged and put into effect. Fourth, check the relationship between Ming and Shi, between what a person's reputation is and what they actually do. Right? Particularly important in trying to decide who to promote. Performance matters. Performance matters. Now, if you say this sounds a little bit like Shangyang, that's okay. Shangyang wasn't all wrong in everything he thought. Right? Fifth, strengthen the foundation of the country. Bangban, right? What does that mean? It means to ensure that people have a livelihood. How can the ruler ensure that? He can't ensure that, right? That the people have a livelihood. That's beyond his power. But what Zhang Zheng says is, I know what is within your power. You can cut down on your expenses. Right? What's interesting here is that he has the zero-sum game view. He says, right, Wo Yi Wei, 天之生财，在官在民，居有此属. The person who said that before actually was Sima Guang in opposing Wang Anshi. And Wang Anshi believed that if you could lead side, if you could manage finances, actually the economy could grow. Sima Guang says, no, it's not possible. The Shangcai is just totally in terms of what the number of people, the population. Thus, the only solution is you either have the money with the government or you have the money with the people. So Sima Guang, in American terms, is a Republican. And although you would think that that our friend Zhang Zhujiang is a legalist, is a fajia, right? He's not. He's actually a Republican too, right? Small government, right? And this, of course, was the great tragedy of dismissing Wang Anshi and his ideas, is that it was not possible until the 19th and 20th century to look back and say, aha, in fact, the only way to increase the wealth of the people is through government's investment. To a certain point. The last point is the military. And again, he looks for things that are within the power of the central government and the ruler to do, right? Not to go to war, rather to find competent generals. Don't worry about, he says, don't worry that you have too few soldiers. Don't worry that your provisions are too few. Don't worry that your generals are incompetent. Just see to better training, more provisioning, improved rewards. No discussion here of the ruler's need to cultivate himself. He did not, when Zhang Zhujiang writes these memorials, he does not appeal to the classics. He does not appeal to the sages. He does not appeal to the wisdom of past writers, or the idea that a certain course of action has a necessary outcome. He defines the obstacles the ruler faces in making government work in what is within the ruler's power to accomplish. He proposes no major institutional reforms, although later on we know he does the Itiao Bianfa, right? But at this point, he's no major institutional reforms. He simply asks the ruler to see to it that government does what it's supposed to do. He tells the ruler, do your job. Right? That's process statecraft. And Lu Kun is doing the same thing. By the way, Lu Kun and Zhang Zhujiang get along quite well. I could have used Hai Rui as an example. Hai Rui is actually quite similar to Lu Kun in many respects. So Lu Kun writes a series of texts spelling out what ought to be expected of officials at all levels of the Ming field administration, from the lowly clerk to the senior official. And this is a book he calls Mingzhi, and it's part of the Shijiang Lu, right? I'm not going to, I'll only mention some things about the Mingzhi, but it's part of this much more elaborate collection, which is called the Shijiang Lu, which includes things like Minwu, a series of chapters, the Shangsha, the Shangjia, you had the local things, the jails, provincial, territorial administrators, and so on. The Shangyue, that's right, that's Shangyue. Community covenant. Like Zhang, Liu does not argue from history or from the classics. He reduces Mingzhi, clarifying functions is how I'm going to translate that title, by supposing that the Ming political system is more or less perfect. Right? The court sets up officials and differentiates functions, Chao Ting, She Guan, Fan Zhi, right? They fulfill both officers, each office is given a name. Both officers and clerks, according to the name, pursue their functions. They fulfill their roles according to the functions. Everyone pulls their weight. There are no problems under heaven. Qiansha wu shi, right? A fine view. And that's what he does in his book. He explains consistently, right? Why is this office important? What is its function? How does it figure in the welfare of the people? What are the duties of those who occupy this office? What must they fulfill? The reason why they fail, which usually turns out to be because they're more concerned with getting promoted than with fulfilling their duties, and advancing their own careers. When he talks about the Xianling, for example, the county magistrate, he lists 34 problems that the county magistrate has to deal with as a fumu guan, as a father and mother of the people official. He advises them to approach office like govern like a doctor, find out what the illness is, give them the right medicine, and everything will be okay. Thus, the problems for Lu Kun, the problems of society are actually problems of government. And the problems of government are actually problems of finding the personnel who subordinate their personal interests to the duties of their office. Liu turns to education to solve that problem. He includes his lectures to Shengyuan as part of the Mingzhi, the local students in the local school, right? He talks to them about the reasons that they have to do shu, why they have to study. He talks about 做人道理, how to be a good person. Students, he says, do you know why the sages and worthies have left you instructions with the classics and histories, and the court nurtures literati with schools? It is because in the universe there is only one solitary moral principle. There's only one solitary moral principle. 乾坤内只有这一种道理，古今人只有这一副心肠。Right? So there's, in the minds of the sages of all antiquity, is this moral principle, and in my mind, there's also this moral principle. But why do we read books? We read books to see that 使天下万物各得其所, so that everything finds its proper place. Why must we attend to 经世之物, the task of ordering the world? Focus on those, not on examinations. Focus on those, 经世之物, not on Shiwen, on examination essays. Ask how the sub-prefecture or district can ensure that corvée assignments are fair, land ownership transparent, brigands prevented, customs improved, storehouses filled, famines alleviated. They should aim to write cogently about changes in values, etc. In other words, they should be part of the governing machine. Right? And after all, they're the ones who create popular opinion. Interestingly, Lu Kun's pragmatic, utilitarian statecraft approach to ordering the world rests on the assumption that the Ming governmental structure is a working system that has no serious flaws as a system. As he writes, the superintendent of education, when I discourse on learning, right? 与讲学自主义六字天地万物一体. In other words, Changhao Wang Yangming's notion of 天地万物为一体. Right? The Ming government can take care of all problems with the structure it has as long as literati and officials are devoted to making it work. The last kind of materials that are created for statecraft learning, materials created to guide people in governing, comes from a very strange variety of books. I'll show you a lot of them. I'm going to use one particular one, Chen Renxi's 八变经世类传. And then we'll end up with the most famous compilation of all, the Huangming Jinshi Wenbian, in 500 yuan. But first, I'm going to have a drink of water. 即使用英文讲也是累死我。So in the Ming, in the Wanli ring in particular, let me go back. Up until before we talked about Lu Kun and Zhang Zhuzheng, all the works I discussed were cut and paste works. Right? That is, they quoted texts, they put them together, then the author might add their own views. Very often, cut and pasting is looked down upon. But what we've seen is, in fact, you can use this method to say very, very different things. So, but it's worth noting that the method, right, had such traction. Because leishu, like these, right, even though they're concerned with governing, these kinds of compilations, right, are, in fact, cut, in some sense, works that cut and paste as well. But what's interesting here, and this is why Chen Renxi's Ba Bian Jingshi Lei Zuan is so interesting. Well, I think it's interesting. Is that it recompiles compilations. It's a leishu de leishu, you might say, right? It takes other works that are themselves leishu and then puts them together in a new package. One of the questions that I do not have an answer to at the moment, but we'll have to eventually have an answer to, is why this happens. Why does this become a trend that's so powerful? They publish very big books, and we know that they publish them because we have copies today still that were printed in the Wanli Ring. Right? So these are expensive, expensive works. Somebody has to be paying for them. Right? Somebody has to be buying them. We think of leishu like this, as books that people, as reference works, 参考书. But there's some indication that, in fact, they were not seen that way at the time. That they were seen as books to read from beginning to end. Right? I have to do more work on that, but there is some indication of that. Okay, so, Chen Renxi, right? In the Wanli reign, all these, Chen Renxi starts to do a bunch of works. And the Ba Bian Jingshi Lei Zuan, he also republishes the Zhen De Shou and republishes the Chou Jun, right? He does a new edition of the Zizhi Tongjian, right? So he's publishing like mad. The Liu Zongzhou, who writes the Muzhi Ming for Chen Renxi, says he was a Jingji Mingchen, somebody well known for his commitment to statecraft, in his interest in statecraft. He had at least 3 different publishing houses, right? Yet he passes the Juren, the Shangshi, the provincial examination, 1597. Not until 1622, after Wanli reign, does he pass the Jinshi. So he does a lot of compilation then, but it's really, he does a lot of the publishing after he gets the Jinshi degree. So, what are the Ba Bian? He lists them in the beginning of the book. His book is only 285 juan, right? And you can see already that the books he's citing and including or bolderizing are much longer. Chou Jun, 3 books by Tang Shunzhi, the Bai Bian, the Jingchuan Shencheng You Bian, the Li Dai Shizhuan Zhou Bian, Huang Zhang's Tushu Bian, Deng Yuanxi's Hanshi, Shang Sha, Feng Yingjing is Huang Mingjing Shi Yung Bian, and Feng Qi's Jingji Lei Bian in 100 yuan. All themselves big books, right? All of which we have today. We have them in Ming Dynasty editions, as well as having them in this text. Why Chou Jun thinks why Chou Jun is first? Well, I don't tell you why, do I? Well, he says that his Qishu Ju Qijia Zhiguo Pingjun, right? It's good on Qijia and Zhiguo. Then he turns to Tang Shunzhi, and he has prefaces for each of these, so he explains why the book is important. Tang Shunzhi's book is organized like this, and you'll say, well, if you think about it, right? It begins with Liu Jing, which is basis for education, right? But then, look at how long the Jujia is. So we're used to the notion that education for literati, for Shiren, in the Ming Dynasty, was by and large Neo-Confucian, Sumi Li Xue education, right? 四书五经, with Juxi's Zhuzhe and the Daoshi Zhuzhe. The Zhuzhe really means Zhuzi Baizha, right? Mozi, Liezi, Zhuangzi, Guangzi, Shangyang, those are the names. So it's a much, much broader view of what education should be and ideas should be. Right? Then he includes Wenyi. Right? This is something that, of course, is condemned by Neo-Confucians very often. Includes a section on painting, on gudong, right? Then we get to a whole series on political topics. Then the liubu, the libu, gongbu, dangdang, bingbu. Tang Shengzhi is an interesting, very interesting person. Right? He also apparently subscribed to the Wangyang Ming notion of Itiandi Wangwu Weiti. But he was also famous for his wenjiang, his prose. He studied mathematics, which is unusual. He was involved in military affairs as an advisor during the war against the pirates, against the Woko. He was an ally of Yen Sung, a controversial prime minister or chief grand secretary. And as I said, the Bai Bian that he has looks at first like a sort of a literati leishu, but in fact, from Chen Renxi's perspective, it's all about government, or it's going to be a source for information about government. If he had wanted to, Chen Renxi could have included two other books, which he doesn't. One is by Peng Dai's Shantang Sekao in 240 zhen. Let's see. And another is the General Encyclopedia Wang Qi, called the Bai Shi Hui Bian. Wang Qi also did a Shu Wenshen Tongkao and continued it. So he's a statecraft guy. All these texts, right, were texts that, in fact, were based on incorporating other texts. So Chen Renxi is incorporating texts that incorporate other texts. It's like a third order piece of work. Wang Qi, for example, begins with, in his 175 works, he talks about heaven, earth, human affairs, social relationships, scientific techniques, Buddhism, Taoism, has some sections on government, talks about literature, poetry, clothing, music, plants, and flowers, right? And some talk about flying things as well. It's not quite a Yuyong Leishu, it's not a household encyclopedia, but it's a kind of a literati elite encyclopedia of everything you should know. And one of the things I love about Leishu is if you ask the question, what is it that people in the 16th century, late 16th century, could know, right? This is an example of what they could know, right? These Leishu that appear. So I think they're well worth studying. Let's go on here. So Chen Renxi's included 4 compilations on statecraft before the Ming. Tang Shengzhi's Shizhuan Zuobian gives accounts of rulers and ministers from Han through Sung, with quotations from the dynastic histories. The Jingchuan Shensheng Youbian consists of memorials, Zouyi, right, and other writings on Han through Sung rulers, ministers, and other political figures and functions of government. Deng Yuanxi's Han Shi has 2 parts. The first, in 82 chapters, consists of records of dynasties and biographies of notable figures from antiquity through the Yuan. The second part, in 21 chapters, is made up of treatises on government functions. The fourth was the Hanlin official Feng Qi's Jingji Leibian, which is the, he was the author, by the way, of the Song Shi Ji Shi Ben Mo. For those, he's now quoted documents, moral texts, historical anecdotes from antiquity through the Yuan dynasty to address 370 different topics concerned with governing. Chen includes only one compilation that was solely devoted to the Ming dynasty. That's Feng Yingjing's Huangming Jingshi Shiyong Bian. which address the structure and functions of Ming government, the management of the bureaucracy, and learning as set out during the reign of the founders. In this case, Zhu Yuanzhang. Some of them will, of course, do the Zhu Yuanzhang and Yongren. Chen could have included, there were other works like this on the Ming Dynasty alone that Chen Renshi could have included but did not. Give you some examples. Gao Dai's, these are all books he did not include, but he could have included because they're doing the same sort of thing as Fang Yingjing's Huang Mingjing Shi Shi Yung Bian. Gao Dai's Hong You Lu, although much shorter, printed in 1618, dealt with 60 different events, mainly about military affairs, which he saw as priorities of the state. Relying totally on private accounts because he did not have access to the Shilu, the veritable records. Lao Kan's Guochao Shenjiang Leibian, 42 Juan, used the reigns of Hongwu and Yongle as models for the court, central government, and functions of the 6 ministries, taking the founder dynasties as models. And he writes in a very interesting statement that he makes. He says, Wu Congzhou, that he's citing the Analects of Confucius. Confucius says at one point, Zhou Jian Yu Er Dai, the Sha and the Shang, right? Yo Yo Hu Wan Zai, Wu Congzhou, I follow the Zhou, right? But for these people, when they cite that, what they're saying is, we don't have to know about earlier periods. It's enough to know about the Ming Dynasty alone, right? Lao Kan, in fact, when he says that, was objecting to those who treated the Ming as a successor to the longer history or saw later reigns as providing better models. In addition to examples already cited, there were a number of other works that did exactly that. He Chaoyuan's Ming Shisan Chao Yi Shi, or the Ming Shancang, 109 Juan, Deng Chou's Huang Ming Yonghua Leibian, Xu Xuezhu's Guochao Dian Hui. Deng Yuanxi's Huang Mingshu, Zhao Hong's Guochao Shenjiang Lu. Right? All of these were books that were devoted just to the Ming Dynasty. The last two ones, Deng Yuanxi and Zhao Hong, are exceptional because they were totally based on biography. But they are actually not meant to be biography collections. They're meant to be textbooks or reference works for governing, right? For Jingshi. Deng Yuanxi begins with emperors, imperial relatives, consorts, extends from officials from high office down to low, to persons of notable character, and out to persons from high office to low, and persons then of notable character who might not be in high office or office. Zhao Hong begins with the imperial house and nobility, but then arranges biographies by office, beginning with the court and central government organs before turning to the provinces. He ends with group biographies of Confucians, filial sons, recluses, and Taoists. So again, these are biographical collections that are meant to be Jingshi Zhixue, right? Zhang Huang's Tu Shu Bian was different. It resulted from a lifetime of compiling charts, graphs, maps, and explanatory text on the classics, heaven and earth, government, and more. Although Chen's title for his work was Ba Bian, he apparently, when he said Ba Bian, he meant Ba Ming Dai de Bianshu, right? Because there was a 9th work that he included. And in fact, he began his book with a 9th work. And this was the Liu Jing Tu by... this is an example from of what Huang Zhang is doing. Let's see. I think I didn't give the characters here, but in any case, there's in the text you'll see it. Yang Sha is Nan Song, right? And he does a similar kind of compilation of charts and pictures and graphs and maps all to explicate the classics. So why include these works? Why include these? What does these have to do with statecraft? And Chen Renqi's own encyclopedia, listed at the bottom, the Qianzhe Lei Shu, right? 120 yuan, 13 bu, 1,400 men, lists 1,460 sources. He's interested in recording everything literati can know from books about the world around them. From the physical realm, what he calls the Chuyu in 42 chapters, to refined customs and rituals, right? And to flying things and others. But it is works compiled by category. He's created 36 general categories in the Jingshi Lei Bian, right? Jingshi Lei Zhuan, in which he fits chapter-long quotations from his chosen compilations. He edits them sometimes, he avoids redundancies, he doesn't quote all of the entire text. But here's an example. The chapters on music quote, in 6 chapters, quote the Tushu Bian, the Han Shi, the Huangming Jingshi Shi Yung. The chapter on the Libu, on the Ministry of Personnel, quotes Da Shui Libu, the Bai Bian, the Shi Zhuan Zhou Bian, Tushu Bian, Deng Deng. So what he's doing is taking these other books. He's created the categories. He takes stuff from other books. It's straightforward. He cuts out some things, but by and large, he's not manipulating them. And then putting them into his categories. So he's redesigned it, if you will. And that may be what makes it unique, right? That everyone is trying to have their own categories. There is, I think, however, a shared point of view throughout Chen Renqi's work and in the works he's quoting. And that is a point that's made by Feng Yingjing when he says, one of the people he quotes, right? When he says here at the bottom, there's Xu and there's Shi. Xu is talk. It's the mind, Xinxue, right? Shi is doing things, action, practice. He says, 出世以文字，人官以资格, by seniority, right? Carrying out government through your ledgers and books, and zhangxue are all empty. They're shu, right? Basically, that's what literati do. It's all shu. So one way of reading these books is, in fact, that they are an attempt to establish something that's sure, something that's practical. Now, some of this is indicated, I think, when Tang Shunzhi in his Shi Zhuan Zuobian, this gives biographies, and gives biographies of all the Sung Dynasty Neo-Confucian Daoxue masters. But when he does the biographies of those Daoxue masters, he doesn't talk about their philosophy. He finds whatever passage he can that give an indication of them as statecraft figures, as governing people. Oh yeah, so it's interesting. Chen himself, at the very end of his life, does a work of his own called the Huangming Shi Fa Lu. Right? And he does it, and he says, in part to criticize Qiu Jun. Because he says, Qiu Jun looks at all of history. He looks at the Deshi Li Luan Zhi. He's great, but when it comes to the 300 years of our dynasty, right, he ignores it. Right? It is Shungu Yi Bijin, Wu Tsung Zhou. Wu Tsung Zhou, as I should have written. Right? He says, I follow the Ming beginning. So why is it that up until the mid-Ming, right, people want to see the Ming dynasty in terms of China's history, and then at this last part of the Ming, all of a sudden they want to see the Ming dynasty in terms of Ming's history, right, alone. Why does that become such a thing? I don't have an answer to that yet, but maybe you do. And I would very much like to hear your opinion. Let's see. I think I should just leave aside the rest of Qiu Jun at this point and get to to the greatest, not a leishu, the greatest compilation of all of the Ming Dynasty. This is the Huangming Jinshu Wenbian. One of the interesting things about the Huangming Jinshu Wenbian is that it proceeded in the Zhuanshou, right, in the first part, with extensive discussions of how they're doing things and what they're doing and who's involved. Everyone gets named. It's 508 juan, completed in 1638, contains over 3,000 wenjiang, memorials, zouyi, essays, letters, various kinds of prose pieces by 429 individuals. It gives short biographies of those 429 individuals. Begins with Song Lian, right, in northern, at the end of the very beginning of the Ming, Yuan, end of the Yuan, beginning of the Ming. So Song Lian is the person who is the editor of the Yuan Shi, one of the editors, and ends with Chen Zushou, who is a Jinshi from 1634. It's punctuated with emphasis markings. It has interlinear comments, not evaluative comments, but explanatory comments. Editorial comments that draw attention to certain passages in the text. The three chief editors, right? Chan Zilong. Oh no, let's see. I don't want to be here, do I? No. The three chief editors, Chan Zilong, Shu Fuyuan, and Song Zhenbi were all from Huating, right, in Songjiang. Chen and Shu died opposing the Manchus, but Song gave in to the Qing and took office. All three had reputations for poetry, and in fact, their beginnings lie in Wenshe and Shishe, in literary societies. They were founding members of the Jishe. The Chen and Shu were founding members of the Jishe Literary Society. All were members of the Fushe. And that's important because they used the Fushe network, a successor to the Dunglin, but much more oriented towards statecraft, to collect texts from around the country. There have been earlier collections of memorials, such as these. Huang Shun's work, Zhang Han's, Sun Shun's, Wu Liang's. What made the Huangming Jinshu Wenbian different? And let me give you 6 things that I think makes it different. The first is it drew on a wider variety of prose writings that address statecraft issues, not only memorials. Second, it was the result of a national effort to collect relevant documents, relying on the editor's Fushe network from local sources, collected writings held by descendants, and published sources. And they give elaborate descriptions of this. This was the first time, this was the first time a national political organization had compiled a statecraft work. Fourth, although some other works had listed many people participating in the editorial work, there had never been anything on this scale before, except things done at the court by the court. Fifth, this was a private work, edited by literati who did not have access to court records, apparently, or high rank. Chen Renxi's compilations were not court commissions either, but he held a position at court. Finally, in contrast to all the foregoing publications, they did not categorize the documents they chose. Instead, they arranged them chronologically by author. As the editors explain in their Fanli, they were selective. They said they were interested in the views of certain kinds of people, although not exclusively. Literary figures who addressed statecraft issues they felt should be included, important grand secretaries, literati who had something to say but did not have successful careers, people with experience managing border problems and so on. They call out some of them by name. They were also interested in topics, fiscal policies, foreign relations, the legal system, and so on. Here too, they name some writers in their Fanli, in their editorial principles. They had things they did not want to do. They did not want to collect more examples of officials praising rulers. They did not want to treat self-cultivation. They did not want to include texts that treated self-cultivation, shoshan, as the problem, as the solution to all problems, or judge people as good and bad. Nor would they give only one side of the debate. They took the position that on major issues, there were multiple sides, and you could not say necessarily that one was automatically correct. This comes close to recognizing politics as part of government, a productive and necessary part of government. In short, Chen, Xu, and Song have given what to their mind is a fair-minded record of how officials, high and low, scholars and others, wrote about the activities and challenges of government during the Ming Dynasty. They favored substantial or practical learning, 实学. As Chen Zilong explains in his introduction, they defended including text on national security issues. After all, they said, grand visions were the basis for the dynasty, not tactics. They believed that they should provide those with power and those without, and with historians with the means to deal with pressing issues of the day, domestic poverty and national defense. But they do not offer a coherent narrative, nor a systematic organization of past writings. And they suggest that what can be shared is a commitment to statecraft itself, not a particular view of it. They have tried to provide a comprehensive account of statecraft writing in Ming on the eve of its extinction. And as I said, it seems to me they come close to making a place for politics in statecraft. Today's lecture, this is the final sentence, right? So, lucky you, yeah, on time too. Today's lecture began with three different ways of conceiving of systematic, trans-dynastic statecraft. Sima Guang on the structure of power, Ma Duanlin on institutions, Zheng Deshou on rulership. Taking the perspective of Chou Jun, we should probably say that Zheng Deshou's statecraft was actually soulcraft. And that Chou Jun was trying to figure out how to draw attention back to institutional statecraft without denying the value of soulcraft. The process statecraft of Zhang Zhuzheng and Liu Kun, and I could have added Hai Rui, I said, avoided issues of moral thought by and large, and soulcraft, although both of them subscribed, or at least Liu Kun subscribed, to the notion of Yitiandi Wang Wu Wei Ti. In essence, their message to the emperor and to the local official was do your job. They assumed Ming institutional system was adequate. I have to admit, at this moment, I am still uncertain about how to understand the compilations and recompilations of statecraft information that Chen Roshi exemplifies. That was much broader than Chen Renshi, as I hope I have shown. Clearly, it was an effort to synthesize as much information as possible. The structure of an encyclopedic work is a kind of theorization, right? A li hua, if you will. And such works appear to be intended for reading and for reference. The practice of being an official is in them, but we could also see them as doing something else, as introducing to the reading public, which was thousands of times larger than the number of officials, introducing to the reading public all aspects of government and the people who govern. That strikes me as an extraordinarily important thing to keep in mind, that this is a moment when there's an attempt to expose government and all ways of thinking about government through history to a much larger population. However, they also, in fact, implicitly were in a debate. Do we need all of history to think about statecraft, or is the history of the Ming Dynasty enough? And if we should follow Ming Dynasty alone with the idea of Wu Congzhou, is it enough to learn from the Arzu, Hongwu and Yongle, or do later reigns teach us something as well? The Huangming Jingshi Wenbian chooses to view the whole of the Ming Dynasty. It takes a broad view, however, and it does not impose a theoretical framework through its categorization. It's an extraordinary work for thinking about statecraft for those who want to think for themselves. That is what I have to say for today. And in my next lecture, next week, for those of you who are interested, I will give you the Chinese text as well. I will turn to the politics of literature and moral thought from the 11th century to the 17th. Thank you very much.
好，我们非常感谢 Professor Peter Bow 今天的演讲。那可以看得出来，他今天特别费心为我们安排的这个中文讲稿，应该帮助很大。那我想起来以前我们在美国念书的时候，如果有这种形式的话，我们就轻松多了。好，那今天我们还有剩下大概20几分钟的时间。那今天我想很多因为文本很多，那在场有很多也不少专家学者在这边，也许可以问一下相关的课题。那么因为牵涉的议题蛮广泛的，那么请各位现在开始。那请麻烦发言的时候，请报告一下您的姓名还有服务单位或者是你就读的单位，谢谢。
You know, usually 我在美国的时候，我们我要在上课的时候，我们就有50分钟要讲，所以有点长。哎，你们还没睡觉，这是很好。我是下午听演讲的话，我一定是要4点钟睡觉。就是我的学生告诉你是这样子。后面。
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your speech today. I'm from the Department of Political Science. I'm a PhD candidate. My English name is Andy Lin. And I'm writing something about children. So I have a question about children. Because when Professor, you said that children try to keep a distance from Zheng Dexiu, I think it is really interesting because as for me, children, what he was doing is to Chongli. He was collecting many knowledge. So why we say that he tries to keep a distance from Zheng Dexiu, from Zhuxi's discourse? Why we can say that? Can we find some evidence from text or some books, or just want to hear Professor to say more about this point? Thank you.
So, I agree. I think that children could say, I am 做冲理之之购物之之冲理 but 冲理 without 真心 right? So 如果我们想到道学家也是真的说对冲理的观点是购物之之可是冲理真心 right? Where's the 真心 part of children? So 我想其实他的冲理就是我们现代的人比较想到是冲理的 right? It's much more thinking about all aspects of a thing, thinking about how things work, right? Thinking of, as he says, it's sure looking. But that's not what Zheng Dexiu is looking at. Right? So that's one point. The second is how before he begins formally with his work, with Zhou begins before Zhen, Di Zhen, right? He has a system called the Da Shui Yan Yi Cheng Yi Bu Bu, right? Why does he have to bu that? Right? So whole discussion of how he's going to supplement Zheng Dexiu's moral philosophy. And that and his supplement of that moral philosophy is based on the notion of Ji Wei de Ji, right? The incipient thing, right? And consequences in affairs, right? So, what is it that he thinks Dexiu did not see? Right? Now, Zhu Honglam, and 以前有一个博士论文是讲这个children，他也有几篇文章。 我想朱红林的看法是，其实他就是不是那么重要，他就是人是要表示他是同意真的修的看法。这个我不，我想就是在这一点，他是否认真的修的基本思想。我也想有些人不要认识了，要说好，我们可以把真的修跟求证合在一起。成人系也是这样子，成人系是把大学研历跟大学研历部合起来再出版，哎 ，But I think they're different。这个是不是一个回答
Is that work? Okay, I think the answer is really inspiring because in my opinion that I think 大学演译部与大学演译 they are two different kinds of books and the author tries to perform different kinds of thinking. So I'm agree with it. But now I'm thinking that so could we say that Qiu Jun he has a distinction between knowledge and morality? Could we say that? And for Chen Dexiu, there is no this kind of distinction.
I have to think about that. Think about that. I don't know.
Also think about this question.
Maybe I'm not sure yet. I have to think about it. Yes. 我们会不会把这个关掉？这个 PPT 可以关掉吗？
Hello, my name is Qishan Chang, and I teach at the Department of Political Science at National Tianju University. And my question is, there seems to be according to your introduction, there seems to be two kinds of statecraft compilations. One deal with some eternal issues, covering all history, and such as Ma Duanling's case or Qiu Jun's case. And the other one is specific. The content is more specific. It's about Ming Dynasty. It's about the affairs of Ming Dynasty. Now, regarding the second type, the examples you gave us are such as Chen Renxi, the most prominent one. So, according to your understanding, to people like Chen Renxi, what are the most significant problems that they think they should deal with regarding the Ming politics? Because Chen Renxi was in the late Ming time, and at the end of the Ming Dynasty, Ming was ended by both Yi Di and Liu Kou. So
right.
Did they detect such problems?
So, what's interesting is that Chen Zilong is quite specific. He says we have two problems: poverty and foreign threats. Right? Very simple. As I read Chen Renxi's prefaces, 他的自序，也是他给每他引用的书，他也写了一个介绍。他不是这样讲。He doesn't seem to be identifying these are the core problems of our moment. Now, maybe it's because I haven't read enough, because there's a lot of material there. It's a very fast and simple method. I look at what authors say about themselves, right? And that's what I sort of focus on first. Now, there's much more to read, right? And so what I've tried to do with each one of these texts is choose one section and read one section carefully, but not the whole thing. I do not get the sense with Chen Renxi that he is trying to define the major problems of the time. Right? But I do think that Chenzi Lung is much more willing to do that. And yet he's, of course, he's in texts, from all of Ming history, so the problems aren't always the same. And if we look at somebody like, so here's a way of trying to deal with your question. 有些类书，经世类书是集中在二组，在跟的朱元璋，这个是为什么？刚好在明末年，有些人是说我们要全部的明代的发展。有些人说，我们就回到这个开始就可以了，吴承畴这个看法。Right? Why do they think that somehow the problems they face, because it's implicitly that says we face problems today, and the solution to our problems is to go back to the beginning of our dynasty, not the Sandai Zhigu, but just the beginning of our dynasty. Right? Why is that? Why would that be true? Why would that be true? Because today I have a lot more research to do before that. Does that answer? Is that a good enough answer for the moment? Not. Okay. Good enough for me.
谢谢包老师很精彩的演讲。我是中研院史语所陈韵如，然后我先试着用中文讲我的，然后再试着翻译成英文。
那不用翻译。
就谢谢您提到把经世之学视为就是一种methods for creating knowledge for governing， 对我很有启发。然后我想顺着那个把经世之学当成一种知识的思路下去问，就是好奇说，因为您提到这些不同的 methods 或是经世之学，好奇他们宋或明有没有他们那些人怎么去判断哪一个方法或哪一个说法比较好？就是 how they decide which methods for creating the knowledge of creating knowledge for governing are more trustworthy or reliable or feasible？
这个问题是很有意思。
就是流通各种各样的。
我这样好，那当然，我今天是把很多的不同的东西放在一起的，所以可以看着，至少可以说从宋到不同的想法。举一个例子，我说是 process statecraft。process statecraft 是不用说古代是怎么样，汉代、宋代是怎么样，就是我们现在的系统是这样子，你的工作就是这样子，你做你的工作，这个是很流行的一个看法。所以可是同时你看刘坤是生到差不多万历末年，对不对？同时也有人承认唐顺这种有一些不同的看法。另外一个问题是 sometimes providing evidence is persuasive. Sometimes providing theory is persuasive. Sometimes providing an organization that can include everything is persuasive. So it seems to me that it would be that there's not only one way of trying to establish what is reliable, right? 另外呢，也有一些类书是引用非常多的小说笔记，and so they say why is it 我们引用这个笔记、这个小说、这个野史，这有可以吗？因为人也有批评，他们说我们利用是必得利用的，因为我们要看朝廷以外的人是怎么样想。So there's another possibility, which is what we're really talking towards for some people is we're talking about public opinion, right? And public opinion doesn't have to have any evidence at all. 你看 Trump 跟他这一派，对不对？没有 evidence 也无所谓，我们都相信是这样子就可以了。 Is that it? Okay? Okay.
我是台大系方翠华。那谢谢包老师今天谈从宋到明的这个经世之学的发展。那我从您的演讲就可以看到，就是从宋代开始有制度的会诊讨论，然后有 memorial 这些诸臣奏议，然后慢慢越来越多，一直形成，它就这些
Cumulative
对 accumulative 越来越多，越来越多，到了最后皇明经世文编的形成，它的数量已经大到其实没有办法读，所以我们不可能期待一个人去读了这些所有的东西，然后去做一个好的官员。就好像明代后面编武备制，你不可能读完了这些书然后再去打仗，因为等你读完了仗就已经战争已经结束了。然后又好像皇亲经节，我们不可能读完皇亲经节然后才说我们去了解13经的意思。所以我觉得这个是一个我在教学的时候碰到的困扰，就是我们怎么去跟学生解释说这些东西，因为它的量大到这么大的时候，它还有真正的实用目的吗？如果我们说经世是为了 practical purpose， 谢谢。
好，那我还记得我在第一演讲座说，我在看学有3个方面，第一是收集资料、收集信息；第二是理论化，理论化可能就是一个怎么安排这个信息，怎么组织的，怎么做分类。第三是实践。我的看法是，大部分的传统时代的西洋的科学方面的学术进入中国以前，而进入西洋以前也是部分的学术也是一个，因为最后成人期有这个冯引经有这个批评说，就有修有诗，就是修就是讲话，是课书是这样子的，真正做。但是我们可以看这些书，这些类书也可以说都是跟实践有关系的。如果你说你要全部看才得到什么，这个是从一个知识、从一个 intellectual 的立场来讲，可能是这个。可是如果你从一个实践的立场去看的话，那你会觉得这对我有趣，这个对我有用，所以这个是一个类书的一方面，是一个参考资料，rather than an intellectual conclusion。可是这个类别，可能是一个理论，depends，就是类别好像每个类书的类别就有点不一样，so that's a kind of an answer。可是我最近跟一个人讲，我就提到这个问题说。他是专门搞这个明末的文学，我就问他，我说，就是像你一样，那么大的一本书你怎么读呢？他说，他有一个影响是当代的人也是读，你买这本书就是读，不是为了做一个参考书。So in that sense, then you say 那个类书。有6经，有诸子百家，有6部，政府的6部，有这么都是不但是经世之学，也是很多可以说是 literati 是世人的世界 ，right？ What that then becomes really is everything you should know, right? But organized in a way, right? One of the problems with 二用类书 is that most of them, I think, are lousy organizationally. But these 类书, these 经世类书, are actually sophisticated works, sophisticated organizations. Most of them, no promise that it's all of them, but they were printed and they survived. Right? So things survive because people read them. it may be that we have to change the way we think about things. I'm not sure yet. When I have an answer, I'll let you know. Ask your opinion. Hi.
我想刚刚的问题啊，那引发我刚刚看的那个冯印经，他提到说讲学以空集。
对。
那刚刚我们不是说这 masterpiece 已经越来越多了，可是呢，冯印经认为讲学以空集。那我很好奇他是怎么样的想法。对，那个 P45页的那一页，45页，讲学以空集。
Yeah, so it's all three though, right? 出师以文思 doing the exams, right? Choosing people on the basis of their writing, appointing officials on the basis of seniority, governing through books, and discoursing on learning with emptiness, right? 结尾书, right? All of them are 书, right? They're all examples of being 书, right? Versus 诗, right? And so, presumably, that's 阳明学派的, 台州学派的都是书, 空集. Yeah, empty. They're empty. 可是讲学有一个特别的意思，对不对？讲学是讲道学的，讲道理，不是讲诗文，不是讲所有的，是一个特别的moral meaning, right?
我不太确定有没有意义的问题啦。就是那个我觉得我们好像不太容易想说那个朱熹会写一本像《大学演义》这样的，就是如何将那个道学那个运用纯粹运用在政治上面的书。那可是这个在13世纪的时候开始有一群道学，就像郑德秀他们就开始试图将道学运用在政治上，然后并且去写专门的书。那这是不是在某种意义上是不是说道学在南宋中后期开始有越来越多的士人试着将道学把它转移到更偏向政治的这个面向上面去？
不知道，所以有几点可以提到，一个是朱熹已经在他给这个皇帝的一些奏议，在绍宗、光宗、宁宗都写了你的心也是天下之本，所以你要注意到，你要想，你应该，可是他的意思是说，你应该做，你的学术应该是道学。应该是格物致知这样子的，可是他同时他也是注意到，这个诗人之学，诗人的责任，地方诗人的责任，而真的修在这方面，把大学演义特别注意到，君主的所扮的角色，所以这不单是说政治，而是说君主的政治。君主的角色，对不对？所以，可是同时我们知道，也是在朝廷，在理宗时代，有一批人是做道学的样子，对不对？是至少这个周密有他的批评，说道学家就是把宋完蛋了，对，因为他们在朝廷这样子，I once quoted that text in a paper, and there was a scholar from Hong Kong who was a very Daoist kind of scholar, got very, very angry at me. He said, "What proof is there of that? How do you know that's true?" He could not accept any insulting of Daoist. Still today, right? But it's possible, Zhonghan, that that has become more political than before? I don't know. Let's look. Let's find out. 时间已经到了。I want to go on. Thank you all very much. 谢谢大家。
然后我再预告一下，我们下礼拜还是有2场呢。最后一场是这个演讲，是礼拜2下午。那另外，事实上我们应校长的要求 ，Professor Peter Ball 在下礼拜2的4点半会讲1小时40分钟左右有关哈佛大学的通识教育的一些现况。所以大家如果有兴趣的话，也可以留下来听。那另外就是最后一场，我们下礼拜5的工作坊，我想包庇德教授会比较多的时间，有互动的时间。所以大家如果对于这几场的演讲有什么样的想法的话，还可以在最后一场工作坊，我们一起来讨论。谢谢大家，好，谢谢。